What is up, guys? So, got the RX-7 behind me, and we've got another video for you right now. And by request, I'm going to keep this very simple. Um, Oil pressure and oil systems and what we're doing with oil to make these things survive. A lot of you have asked. Yeah, Alex's motor is a stock T2 with a beautiful Bridgeport work, but that thing just has ARP studs in it. Oil pressure is the key. Let me explain, because it seems to be getting a lot of you confused. What viscosity do I run? How often do I change my oil? Those are real simple things, right? The bottom line is a rotating assembly of a rotary engine is sitting on a film of oil. So we don't have main bearings. We don't have any way to control the eccentric shaft beyond oil pressure. So that's why it's going to be your number one and only thing keeping your rotary engine alive. So what do? We can't just run it to the moon all the time, right? Can we? Can we freeze things? What are we going to do to make this better, right? The very simple fact is, because these engines have such large tolerances on the inside, we can actually make it to where like a 20W50 is just fine. Now, normally on a reciprocating engine, you're going to have much smaller oil passages, and that will result in part of the motor not being lubricated when cold. The warm-up viscosity of 20 will result in just not enough flow going through the engine. That's why when your engine's ice cold, you'll see an oil pressure that's, much higher than when it's hot. It's just because it's not flowing as well. So I recommend, personally, running as much oil pressure as you can get. I would say running the largest oil film possible so you have a higher capacity. That would be competition Mazda bearings, and maybe like a 25W60 if you can get your hands on it, 20W60, 10W60. That might be the ideal thing for a hot environment for oil for these engines. If you're in a colder climate, of course, you can run something like a 10W40, but that's very rare by comparison to most of us will want a 20W50. So, if you haven't noticed, we got a new camera setup. I don't have keeps, and my shit still doesn't run, so there you go. But what I can tell you is capacity is definitely going to be key, because as these things get higher up in RPM and higher up in power, and you have deflection of your eccentric shaft, as you've got things working against it, what I can tell you to do is increase your oil pressure. Now, that does not fix everything, because at, let's say, 10,000 RPM, you might have 130 psi on a perfectly shimmed kit. Be great. But you're going to reach a point where you actually run out of capacity. You'll still have all the pressure, and then all of a sudden it's like oil pressure can't keep up. Which is why a lot of folks go with a dry sump, which is increasing the oil pump size to where you can get your flow at higher RPM. So a lot of people ask, what is the maximum, allergies I swear, what is the maximum RPM that I should run my motor out to? Realistically, in a factory oil pump, whether it's a T2, REW, whatever you have, that'll run right around 92 to 9750, depending on, what's all going on, what bearings you have in there, because that does change, of course, and how things go. So I won't name names, but some shops, they'll run the tightest bearing clearance, which means that now you have overall less oil in the engine to extract heat from, but that also allows it to rev higher. The problem is that when you're at a higher RPM, your oil film is now thinner. Rather, the thickness between the eccentric shaft and the bearing clearance is smaller. It's not thinner. I should be very clear on that. And that's simply due to the fact that you have a smaller bearing clearance, and therefore less oil is able to lubricate between that area. Now, the only way to increase the film strength is to one, run a thicker weight oil, so your viscosity is higher, or two, it's going to be to have higher oil pressure, which is what I'm suggesting right now. So those are your two main things to be focusing on. When you have a thicker weight oil, it's harder to cool, but really it doesn't matter. That's something that you should have in spades. That does a third of your cooling for this car anyways, for these engines. So that's where your mind needs to be. Always have an abundance of heat exchanger. That's not a rule. So, in saying that, oil pressure, you know where they fall at the limits. Oil temp is really dependent on your region. Your engine builder will tell you what to do. And I think that just about covers it. Oh, oil change intervals. That's the last step. So, if you have a rich running air to fuel ratio, these engines suffer from oil dilution. Oil dilution is when you have oil passing through the motor, and as it's going through, an abundance of fuel passing through the motor, and as it's burning through, it's seeping into your oil system. So you'll pull out your dipstick, you'll smell it. Does it smell like oil? Does it smell like gasoline? Does it smell like E85? Whatever it is. When you have E85 and methanol, it's much more likely to be there because your capacity and the total amount of fuel going through the engine is much higher. So that makes your oil change intervals, because now your oil is technically a fuel, or starting to, and you'll see the oil level rise with time instead of decrease like a standard motor. That's going to make your oil change interval go down. So 2,000 miles for an average motor that's running way too rich, that's not a bad oil change interval. 3,000 miles for a good synthetic that's running rich E85, kind of worth it because you're protecting those bearings. This is one thing that we can't be cheap on. So it's kind of tough. You kind of have like hypercar type maintenance when it comes to way more often than you'd expect. But this is just one of the compromises. That's all we have to really worry about is changing cheap oil, right? And I did just say cheap. I mean, you don't have to run crappy oil. You can run really good stuff. My stuff, I've got 3 main brands that I'll be using. So for braking stuff, you can run something like this braking oil here. This is 10W30 from Comp Cams, has a lot of ZDP. Got another braking oil from Pengrade over here. Let's see if that even focuses. There you go. Pengrade, yep. And then, realistically, what you want to do is have an oil you can really lean on. That would be something like Renewable Lubricants, Chet. These guys do freaking amazing stuff. Chet, it's a pleasure to be working with you guys. We've tested this stuff at 650 horsepower all day long, and that's what they do. On a 2-rotor, mind you. 2 different 2-rotors, 3 or 4 different 2-rotors at this point. That, and of course, you've got your Valvoline VR1. The next video I'll be doing is a premix, quantities and why to run certain things, and I have an oil metering pump reservoir and why I'm doing that, and simple stuff with premix. But I think that'll solve or answer most of your questions for oil, capacity, pressure, and viscosity. So keeping it quick and dirty, and hope you guys like the new camera setup and the no keeps, keeping the rotary helm all ready to go. All right, guys, talk to you in a bit. Cheers.